Hi, everyone. How's it going? Good? Yeah? Well, good. Me too. I'm glad. We're all good. So I'm Pastor Alex. I'm so glad you're here. If you've been with us for the last month now, then you know we have been journeying through the book of Daniel as a quest for just discovering how the Bible aims to equip people who call themselves Christians, who call themselves the people of God, how we equip ourselves to live in a world full of kings and leaders and bosses and parents and all sorts of different people with power who have no interest in following Jesus and are not Christian. In a world that is ultimately largely ungodly, how do the people of God navigate a world that's like that while honoring God, right? This is a difficult question, and that's why we've been reading the book of Daniel, because the book of Daniel is the epitome of this problem, right? And I congratulate all of you, because this is really hard. Each week seems to get harder and harder and harder. You all keep showing up. So this is good. The Spirit is here. It's moving, but the challenge is good, right? Right? Good. Well, I just want to say this to remind us that the challenge is good, because guess what? It just keeps getting harder. And we're going to dive into chapter 5 today, but I encourage you, like always, to listen to this story with fresh eyes, with fresh ears, maybe as if you've never heard it before, which, like, we've heard Daniel in the Lion's Den and the burning furnace in Sunday school maybe when we were little. Has anyone heard Daniel 5? Do we even know what happens in Daniel 5? In Sunday school? Really? All right, cool. Well, I encourage you. Like, let's hear it with fresh eyes, fresh ears. We're going to read the story like always, so it won't be on the screen, but I encourage you, turn on a Bible, read one, or just let me tell the story and let your imagination bring you into the story so that you see things as an adult that you might not have seen when you were younger. And then we're going to just look at what it has to say for us following God in the world. All right, we ready? All right, let's go. So this is chapter 5. King Belshazzar. So Nebuchadnezzar is not our king this time. It's Belshazzar. Made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the thousands. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, he brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. So, like we talked about in chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar brought the army of Babylon to Israel, and he destroyed the city, he destroyed the temple, and all of the treasures that were inside he took back with him. And now, here they are, years later, probably decades later, and they're drinking wine at this celebration in Babylon out of cups that were in the temple. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever." Because this is how you address a king, right? It's another thing we've learned in Daniel. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. He's like Yoda. He's this old, ancient, wise guy of the past that we've got to hunt and find, right? Like, this is good storytelling, right? Right? There is a guy who can save us. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now, the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations to solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and your rewards for another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed. And whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up. And whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the people, the children of mankind, and his mind was like that of a beast. And his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house, the cups and such, have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command. And Daniel was clothed in purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Don't you love it when there's a happy ending? So, Daniel chapter 5, right? Again, there's a prophecy, there's a message that needs to be interpreted. Daniel's the only one who can do it, and he shows up, and because he's a man of Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, he can see and understand things that the other wise people can't, and he interprets it. And what happens? He says, well, the interpretation is pretty clear. God's not happy with you, and so you're going to die and lose your kingdom. And that's exactly what happens. That's the story in a nutshell, right? That's what happened. Does anyone notice the two big differences between Daniel 5 and almost every other story in Daniel so far? Anyone? What's the glaring big one? I know we're in church. You can talk, though. What's that? He's not been punished. The king you're talking about? No, Daniel. That's true. What else? There's two, really. There's two big things, and we're going to talk about both of them. Does anyone catch the other one? The king died, right? Nebuchadnezzar, how many times has been scolded by God, has had some sort of situation where God needs to talk to him about something that he's doing wrong, and he's been threatened because he's doing something wrong. But Nebuchadnezzar keeps on living life, right? Like things are fine. And let's face it, Daniel, who watched Nebuchadnezzar tear his city to the ground, probably kill his friends and his family, then kidnapped him, took him to this far place, and then made him serve this new king, is probably waiting, you would think, for the day that this guy gets smited upon, right? But we never really see Daniel actually wish this upon Nebuchadnezzar. And even when God threatens him, Nebuchadnezzar, just like last week, he actually repents. And even though he was, made to be humbled, like we saw in this story, he gets his kingdom back, right? But you get this guy who does something wrong, and God calls him out on it. And what happens? That night, he's dead. What in the world is so different about this guy that he's got to die? And Nebuchadnezzar, he actually gets his kingdom back. He gets scolded, but then gets to just keep on going. That's the big question. And the thing is, there's something different here that's happening that affects the deeper meaning when you read in between the lines. So we've been going through Daniel chapter 3. We see there is a problem when a nation sets itself up, or a community or a group of people set themselves up saying our nation, our country, our culture, our way of life is in the image of God, and everyone else's isn't. That nation becomes evil, right? And then we get to chapter 4 last week, and when an individual does this, when an individual says, I'm made in the image of God, and other people are just a little bit less, become evil, right? This is a different situation. This man took these goblets, which we think, they're just cups. But they were cups that came from the temple in Jerusalem. They were cups that were used specifically for the worship of God. And he used them to throw a party, and he used them to worship gods that are lifeless. This isn't like Greek and Roman things. They're not worshiping the god of gold, the god of silver. No, they're worshiping gods that are made of these things. And the Bible is always very critical of that because God is powerful. He's a person. He communicates with us, but yet people still continue to worship pieces of stone that they made. They can't talk back. They don't care about anything. Like, this is a crime. And ultimately, what he does when he drinks from these goblets, when he passes them out this way, when they celebrate with the party, is he's making a statement about the God of Israel. And what kind of statement do you think he's making? Yes, some God he was. He thought he was so good. He thought he had this temple My nation destroyed that nation. And here I am. These things were sacred. I party with them. This man is not just saying he's made in the image of God and others are not. He's looking God in the face and saying, I'm God. He's not looking at other humans and saying, I'm God compared to you. I'm better than you. He is looking at Yahweh and saying, look how big I am. Then the other thing that's weird in this story, Daniel actually treats him differently, right? All the other times, right? Nebuchadnezzar, I have this problem. And Daniel gets the interpretation, and things aren't looking good for Nebuchadnezzar. What did he say last time? Nebuchadnezzar, I wish this was for your enemies. I wish this was for someone else. I wish this wasn't for you. But he comes in and talks with Belshazzar, and he has an attitude. Did you catch that? And notice, though, things are different. They called him Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar didn't call him Daniel, right? Nebuchadnezzar gave him a new name. He gave him a Babylonian name, which in some ways is hurtful to Daniel, like your name's not good enough, you're going to be one of us, we change your name. But it's also a sign of respect of saying, we accept you as one of us now. But how does Belshazzar introduce Daniel? You're not one of us. You're Daniel, right? You're one of those exiles from Judah, right? In case you forgot. You're one of those people that we conquered, right? You're here as an exile, right? Because my father made you come here? Okay, just so long as we're on the same page here that you, Daniel, are of a conquered lesser people. Now you can speak to me. What's going on? This man treats him with utter disrespect. And Daniel has an attitude. Do you think that's why? I think that's part of it. But I think that really just speaks to the difference between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. This man believes he's on a far different level. This man thinks he truly is God. He's mocking Daniel's God while they're having this conversation. Right? And Daniel, well, he's got an interesting place at the table here, right? He can read what's on the wall and he knows what it means. Do you think he already knows what's on the wall before he addresses? Of course he does. He's coming into the court with this king who's freaking out. You know, there's actually some translations that if you translate it literally implies that it's not his limbs were shaking. He might have actually soiled himself. He was so scared when he saw this. I don't know, interesting. But anyway, Daniel comes in to this king who is terrified, asking for help. None of his wise men can help. And he's looking at him saying, if you do what I ask, I'm going to give you purple robes. I'm going to give you chains of gold. I'm going to make you the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Meanwhile, Daniel's seeing the thing saying, you'll be dead tonight. Yeah, I wouldn't care what he had to give me either. Is it humility? Maybe. Or is it him saying, yeah, that's awesome. I don't know that I want to be associated with you because you'll be dead tonight. Your kingdom will be ruled by another nation tonight. He has seen something that he never saw with Nebuchadnezzar. He saw explicitly in writing God's judgment. And his judgment was that Belshazzar has failed. He's been judged. He was found wanting. He's now going to die. This is the difference between God and everything else. Only God is fit to judge. Only God has the goodness and the mercy and the love to judge perfectly. Humans cannot see the hearts of men. We cannot judge. And as soon as we do, we look God in the face and we say, we can do it better. we can do what you can do. Daniel walked into this room, and Belshazzar had already made a declaration. I am better than you. He had looked God in the face and said, I am better than you. I have conquered your nation, and Yahweh, if you don't believe it, I'm going to party with your sacred objects tonight. And God said no. Nebuchadnezzar repents. How many times have we watched Nebuchadnezzar, though he's messed up, though he's got his problems, at the end of the day recognize, you know what? This God of Israel is in fact powerful. Belshazzar laughs, and he's destroyed. Because God can judge, and he saw a man not just saying, I made it in the image of God, and other people are a little less. This is a man who full-blown has decided, I am God, and I can judge who is good and who is evil. Not because I've been given this power, but simply because I have it. And that's the kind of power God has, right? Do you see the fundamental difference here? Between just thinking we might be better than some people, rather than actually thinking we truly are God and what this kind of judgment means. That is what Daniel is trying to teach us. We cannot be judges, lest we say that we are God. So what in the world does that mean for us today? Nothing's changed. We still cannot be judges. We cannot live our lives looking out at other people and decide who is good and who is evil. Because when we do that, we begin to take God's place and we begin to decide who should live and who should die. This might be an extreme case. I'm sure it's never happened with anyone in here, but I can tell you, I have friends who call themselves Christians. I have friends who call themselves followers of Jesus, who will send me news articles about things going on in the world, things going on in schools, things going on in workplaces, things going on in Washington, things going on in our own state building. And then we'll send afterwards, when is God going to destroy these people? And when we ask questions like that, we reveal that a decision's already been made. These people deserve to be destroyed. And the problem is, when we make those decisions, we look God in the face and we say, I can do it better. I can see the hearts of men and I can decide who should live and who should die. We decide, I know nothing about the lives and hearts of these people. But God, these are the ones you should punish. These are the ones you should burn. And Daniel is saying, only God can do that. We never saw Daniel act this way with Nebuchadnezzar, the villain, because God had never judged. Daniel, here you say, look, now I have permission to hate these people, Alex. Finally, we can have permission to retaliate. But this story is different. Daniel's attitude changes towards this man, not because he decided this man should burn, but because God had made a judgment. This is what God has to say to us today. So this is from 1 Corinthians, and this is Paul writing to a church where a lot of things are going wrong. And he says, for what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge The evil person from me. I meant to put the first part of it. Anyway, this is a complicated verse. And as we walk through this, there's two things we have to know about how we're applying this. There are clearly two different thoughts that Paul has on judgment. There's judging people outside the church, which we're going to talk about first, and then there's judging people inside the church. Okay? So first, when we look out at the world and we see rulers, leaders, like, let's face it, how many kings do we actually know? They're out there. But bosses, politicians, whoever, when we see these people who are not Christians, Paul is saying, hey, how dare you declare that they should burn, that they're the ones worthy of punishment? It's not our job to judge them, it's God's. And he's saying for you in the church, realize that these people live by another standard. They don't love with peace, joy, hope, and love. Why would they? They don't know the God who brings peace, goodness, love, compassion into this world. It's just not fair. But I can't tell you how many Christians I know who look at people who don't know God, look them in the face and say, how dare you? These people don't know God. Why would we judge them as if they do? We don't know their life. We don't know their hearts. We don't know what's going on. And we only see their actions. And Paul is saying, don't worry about them. Because at the end of the day, God is perfectly capable of doing his job as a perfect judge. Instead, what we should be doing is looking at a world that doesn't follow God, and instead of getting angry, instead of looking at them and saying, well, I can just speed up the process and be God and decide what kind of punishment they need or deserve, or we can look at them and we can have sorrow. I can tell you, when I interact with people who don't know God, it is very often that when we have real, deep, vulnerable conversations, they are sad because their lives feel like they don't have any meaning. They feel like there's no real love in their life. And why would they not feel this way? The world that doesn't follow Jesus says we're here to live and to die, and that's it. Eat today, die tomorrow. Fill the void, fill the loneliness with whatever you can find to cope. And we all know there are plenty of things in this world to help fill the void and help make us feel like we're not so lonely. But everything that's not Jesus, it doesn't really help. And the last thing these people need is someone who actually knows of the hope that we have, that the world won't actually be this way because of the Savior that we have, looks at them and says, hey, before you meet this God, I've already decided. You're evil and you should burn. Go away. No, these are people who need someone who knows what they don't know to say, what if I told you life isn't meaningless? What if I told you life isn't hopeless? And there is love and there is a way to fill that void that isn't shallow and hollow. However, Paul seems to have a different idea of how we deal with sin in the world when we're dealing with people in the church. And before I go into this part, and if you haven't heard anything I've said, if you're going to forget all of it, that's okay. But listen for this last part, because this is so important. How do we deal with people sinning when they do know God? I'm going to pull up another verse, but before we pull up that one, I want to talk about another one, just to set the stage. Does anyone know what Jesus has to say about this? Tons of us have been going to church for a long time. What does Jesus say about judging? What's the famous one? Yeah, it's Matthew 7, right? I heard whispers around. Do we know what Matthew 7 is? Don't judge, right? before you judge another person about the speck in their eye, what do? I want that at the forefront of our mind before we go into this next verse, right? Because Paul in 1 Corinthians makes it clear that judging people outside the church isn't our business because they don't know the God that we know. They don't know what our job needs to be to show them. Do you know what Jesus says about loving people who aren't in the church? Is this not the forefront of our mind? He says, go and make disciples. He says, you live in a world full of people who think that the cross should have killed me, that the end of their story is death and dying and decay, and you just watched me rise from my grave. Don't look out at the rest of the world and say, burn. Go and make disciples. Tell them about what you just saw. You watched me die a month ago, and we're having a conversation right now. This is the power of God, and it's amazing. It's so amazing. These early followers literally changed the world. We're talking about Jesus today because what they saw was so amazing, they couldn't stop talking about it. And so Jesus doesn't say, sweet, now that I'm back and you see that I am God, let's hope the rest of the world burns. He says, go and make disciples. Tell them what you saw. Tell them that there is hope, that death doesn't have the power it once had. I died. Death took me, and I overcame it. The world is changed. Go and make disciples. And Paul says, why are you judging them? They don't know what Jesus did. Why are we treating them with hate and disdain? But he says, but what's going on in your church? This passage in 1 Corinthians is really hard to talk about without giving another sermon because he's talking about a church where a man is sleeping with his father's wife. And he's saying, why are you guys okay with this? You see people on the outside. You have friends, politicians, all sorts of different people who are greedy, swindlers, selfish, self-absorbed, and you talk like they are the scum of the earth. And in your own church, you have a man that's doing something they don't even do. How dare we condemn the world when we've got a plank in our eye? Paul says, before you judge the world, what's going on in the church? The one nation whose king is Jesus. And so, what do we do when Belshazzar is walking around drinking goblets from God? We turn around and we look in a mirror. We turn around and we say, yeah, the world is pretty messed up. And I want to make disciples, but the problem is when they walk into my church, it's worse. If we are going to be a church here in Fort Lupton that changes the world, that brings hope and love to a world that is hopeless, then we can't be a people who act as if we're God, condemning others, while at the same time, we're doing the same exact thing. I want to tell you a story about a man named Tony. I didn't make it up. This is a real man, but I'm scared to say his last name lest I say it wrong. So if you would like to hear the full story, text the text line. Let me know. We can get it to you. I'm just going to tell you the short version. This is a man who grew up in the church with Christian parents, had a good Christian upbringing. And around the age of 12, he had a dream that terrified him. This 12-year-old boy had a dream that he was cuddling his friend who was also a boy. And he woke up terrified. And as he kept living life, he started to realize that he was attracted to people that he wasn't supposed to be attracted to. I'm talking about this man was gay. He didn't want to be gay. He didn't choose to be gay. In fact, he hated himself because his parents had made it clear to him that if he's gay, then he's one of those people that need to burn. And so one night, he couldn't handle it anymore. The self-hate, the not being able to talk to anyone in his family or even his church. So he walked into his parents' room and he grabbed his father's gun and he sat down on his bed. And he began to think about what his parents would think in the morning when they found him. And you know what he thought? They're going to be happy, because they could never be happy with a gay son. And so he sat in his bed, building up the courage at 1:30 in the morning, and he got a phone call. He answered the phone. And it was one of his friends from church who said, "Hey man, something weird just happened. I've been playing video games with my buddy, and I thought of you, and I just started crying. And so I ran out of the house, and I just started praying for you. And I don't know what's going on, but I just had to call you, and I just had to let you know that God loves you. And this is really weird, but I couldn't not call you and tell you that." And they read Psalm 5 together, and they hung up. And this boy said, "I know that God loves me." And he started a Bible study. He's married now to a woman. They have kids. He's a pastor of a church, and he has changed countless lives. But the problem is, his church, the people of God, told him in his darkest hour that there's something wrong with you, and so you should burn. You should die. And he believed it. But God moved. And how many of us have had conversations with our Christian friends saying, "I have sin in my life." And they've grabbed our hand and they've cried with us and they've said, "It's okay. God has got you. He loves you." But then there's someone who's not a Christian who tells us about other sins. And we look them in the face and we say, "Well, you're going to hell." This is what Paul says we should do when we have sin in the church. This is from Ephesians 4, verse 29. "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." There is sin in this church, and we all need to deal with it. And when they come to you, when your friend, your spouse, your child comes to you and they say, "There's sin in my life," we can either address it with a mindset of judgment, or we can address it with the mindset of, "I want to build you up." The Bible, Paul, is not saying, when there's sin in the church, "Well, you guys said that cool prayer, so don't worry about it." Those guys, they didn't say the prayer, so yeah, let's hope they tumble and die. But you guys in the church were cool. No. Paul makes it very clear that when we follow Jesus, there is a way to follow Jesus, and there is a way to not follow Jesus. And we, as Christians, if we're going to say Jesus is king, we need to live like he actually is king. But the truth is, and we all know this, it's not so easy. It's hard. And we've got to help each other. That's the whole point of the church. But before we judge someone for the speck in their eye, we need to take out the plank in ours. So when we read the news, I'm asking you, don't be overcome with anger. God will judge how he judges, and he judges perfectly. Trust him. Instead, when you see things that are wrong in our world, don't have anger. I would tell you, if anything, have sorrow. Pray. Go and make disciples. Let our hopeless world know that there is, in fact, hope. And let's pay better mind to our churches than those who don't even claim to follow God. But when we do that, we don't do that with a mindset of condemnation and judgment. We address the sins around us, even with ourselves, with a mindset of building each other up. See what I'm saying? The difference is in here, right? I'm not telling you to disregard sin anymore. Sin is real. Sin is why our world is so terrible. But what I'm saying is, how do we interact with it in a world that's not godly? We do it with the hope that it can change. Jesus claims he'll judge, and I think it's true. Jesus will decide who needs punishment and who doesn't, who's in his family and who's not. I know that's tough to say sometimes, but we need it. There's evil in our world, and it needs to be addressed. But it's not our job to decide what evil needs to be punished and which doesn't. It's not our job to decide who's in the family of God and who's not. It's our job to make disciples, to spread the good news. And when those around us need help, not to judge, but to say, what are your needs and how can I build you up? It's a difficult line to walk. And I don't know how God is going to test you in this, but I encourage you, as your pastor, I plead with you. When it happens, have the mindset that God will do his job, and our job is to build the church with love and mercy and encouragement. Will you pray with me?